Okay, I think we'll get started. So if you can take your seats, that would be great. And if you're online streaming, make yourself comfortable. So welcome everyone to the 15th annual Dean W. Lytle Electrical and Computer Engineering Endowed Lecture Series. I'm Eric Clavens. I'm the chair of the ECE department. In 1958, Dean W. Lytle joined our department, then called Electrical Engineering, as an assistant professor after earning his undergraduate degrees at UC Berkeley. And our speaker today is from Berkeley, so there's something there, and his PhD and MS at Stanford. Dean's research and teaching focused on communications, networks, and signal processing. And during his 40-year career at UW, Dean was a beloved teacher, mentor, and intellectual powerhouse in our department. He taught generations of students, authored 2 textbooks, and collaborated with engineers at Boeing, Honeywell, and Bell Telephone. Dean passed away in 2003, but his memory lives on in this lectureship. The Lytle Lecture Series, as it's come to be known, was established in 2006, the centennial year of our department, through fundraising efforts by Louis Scharf, in collaboration with Marilyn Lytle, the Lytle family, Dean's graduate students, his colleagues at Honeywell's Marine Systems Center, and the UW-ECE community. Over its 16-year history, the Lytle Lectureship has become our department's premier annual event, featuring researchers from around the world who, like Dean, work in communications, networks, and signal processing. I would like to thank personally all those who have contributed to support this effort and make this lectureship a staple of the department. So thank you, and I know there's members of the family and former students and so on online, so hello and thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone who organized this year's event and give special thanks to the chair of the Lytle Lectureship Committee, Professor Mariam Fazal, who holds the Morthy Family Professorship. Mariam also leads the NSF's Institute for the Foundations of Data Science, which brings together mathematicians, statisticians, computer scientists, and engineers from across the country to develop the theoretical foundations of data science. Mariam, thank you for your leadership with this seminar and across the campus. Now I'd like to welcome our faculty host, Professor Joshua Smith, who is the Milton and Delia Zuchel Professor for Entrepreneurial Excellence and coordinator of our UW-ECE Professional Master's Program. Josh holds a joint appointment with the Allen School. He leads the Sensor Systems Laboratory, which invents new sensor systems, devises new ways to power them, and develops algorithms for using them. His group's research has wide application in the domains of robotics, ubiquitous computing, and human-computer interaction. In addition, this year Josh was named the inaugural director of UW's Amazon Science Hub, dedicated to advancing innovation in robotics, AI, and their applications. Please welcome Professor Smith, who will offer a few remarks about our invited Lytle lecture speaker.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to have Anca Dragan here today. Anca is an associate professor in the EECS department at UC Berkeley. Her goal is to enable robots and AI agents more broadly to work for and around people. She's a leader in combining technical machine learning-based methods with human-robot interaction, allowing machines to learn about people. She runs the Interact laboratory, where she focuses on algorithmic human-robot interaction, algorithms that move beyond the robot's function in isolation and generate robot behavior that coordinates well with human actions and that is aligned with what humans actually want the robot to do. Anca got her PhD from CMU's Robotics Institute. She helped found the Berkeley AI Research Lab and is a co-PI of the Center for Human-Compatible AI. She's won numerous awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, or PCASE, the NSF Career, Sloan, Okawa, O&R Young Investigator Award, MIT's Technology Review 35 Under 35, and the IEEE RAS Early Academic Career Award. Welcome, Anca. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. I got the email, I thought I have to say yes because I love UW and I love Seattle, and I haven't been here since 2015 when I was applying for jobs and interviewing. I have to share that on a personal note, this is my first trip that I'm taking away from my baby. He's 11 months now, and this is the first time I'm away from him. So I'm excited and nervous at the same time, so bear with me. I wanted to share a little bit today about my career journey in this field of human-robot interaction and algorithmic human-robot interaction, and describe a little bit of what it means to work in this kind of area. And I'll say that I'm immersed in a world of robotics. I have friends who have drone companies. I work on robots like this arm in my lab. I spend one day per week at an autonomous driving company called Waymo. And I will clarify that I am not speaking today as a representative of Waymo. I'm wearing my Berkeley academic hat. But I can share with you that in my day-to-day life in San Francisco, I run errands taking our Waymo cars, and it's sometimes there's absolutely no one at the steering wheel, and it's just this really magical experience. Now, how did I get to do all this? Well, I fell in love with AI and robotics back in 12th grade. I am born and raised in Romania, and I read the Stuart Norvig book, whatever I could understand from it, in 12th grade. And what really resonated with me was this notion of an intelligent, you see, this is called the Intelligent Agent book, this notion of an intelligent agent. And that meant this notion that you can take an agent, a robot, give it an objective or a goal, and it just figures out what actions to take in order to achieve that goal or optimize that objective. And it figures that out on its own. You don't have to tell it what to do, you just have to tell it the goal, and it just figures stuff out. And that really, really resonated with me back then. So I've learned that the way robots work is they take actions that change the physical state of the world, right? They move stuff around. They have sensors, like cameras and so on, and they get sensor readings that help them estimate the state of the world, like where stuff is. And then when you give them an objective or a goal, then they can figure out how to sequence their actions to achieve it. And this is what's called many things. What we're going to call it today is optimal decision making. And again, what I love about optimal decision making is this notion that it enables robots to figure out their own strategies for interacting with the physical world. So what does that mean? What do I mean by strategies for interacting with the physical world? Let's just go through a couple of examples together. The first example that I want to share is really a toy one, but it's illustrative. I use it when I teach Intro to AI. So bear with me. We have, imagine this is a robot in a maze. And the state is its position in this maze. Its objective is as follows. You see there's a gem here and a fire pit over here. If it ends up where the gem is and takes the gem, it gets +1 brownie points. If it falls in the fire pit, it gets -1 because it burns. And so in both of these situations, that's it, it's the end of time. And then for every action it takes, it pays a small living reward or living cost, like 0.01, say, right? And that's to encourage it to be efficient. It can move up, down, left, right. And what you need to know about these actions is as follows. Let's say it's trying to move forward. With 80% probability, it actually succeeds moving forward, unless there's a wall, in which case it stays in place. With 10% probability, its wheels slip a little bit and ends up to the left. With 10% probability, its wheels slip and ends up to the right. Okay? So there's uncertainty in how the world works. So we take a robot, we give it, okay, here's the state space, here's the action space, here's the objective, and we throw optimal decision making at the problem. And what does the robot do? It figures out how to move in this maze in the optimal way. So here is the solution it comes up with, and The arrow suggests points where to the action the robot thinks is optimal to take in that particular location. And you'll see some obvious things, like if it's next to the gem, it will try to go towards the gem. That makes a lot of sense. If it's over here, it tries to go around. If it's over here, it goes to the left as opposed to straight towards the gem. Why is that? Say it loud. Why? Yeah, it doesn't want to fall in the fire pit, so if it went over there, it would have this 10% chance of slipping, right? So it goes all around, which is interesting. What I tell my students is that optimal decision making not only as a way of formulating robotics problems, but it's a way of living. It teaches you how to take good decisions in your life. Sometimes you have to go away from the direct path to the goal in order to safely achieve it later. That naturally falls out of this framework. Now, more interestingly, what's happening here? It's going towards the wall. Why is it going towards the wall instead of towards the gem? Yeah, so if it went straight, that'd be a 10% chance of falling into the fire pit. The living reward is negative 0.01. And it figures out that the optimal thing to do is to play it safe. If it finds itself in this state, what it will do is it will sort of push against the wall, right? And that way, at some point, it will either stay 80% of the time it stays put, but then several times it go to the left or to the right, and then it can be safe. Today, this morning, my husband was at home with Lucas, my kid, who I left home for the first time, remember that? Sent me this picture of Lucas finally having developed this strategy of walking against the wall so you don't fall down. So I thought that was funny. Now, what's important here, this is what I mean by strategy. This strategy of how you're going to solve the task, versus pressing yourself against the wall, that is something that the robot figures out on its own. I don't know if I would have figured out if I looked at the problem that maybe my intuition would say to just go for it, go forward. And that's just the consequence of solving the decision-making problem that we stated. And what's even better is that you get generalization. What do I mean by generalization? Well, if I change the setup, if I move the maze around, if I move the fire pit around, the robot adapts. It figures out something else. That's the new thing that's optimal. Here, what we did is we made it a little more costly per time step. And you'll see this quick adaptation of, okay, well, I'm still going around this way, but here's no longer worth it, right, to just go against the fire pit. It takes too many steps. So this generalization, right, you get that. So that's one example of this grid world. Now, let me share with you another example that's from actual research that people do. So back in 2010, I was in grad school. I did my grad school at Carnegie Mellon, as you heard, with Srinivasa, who is now at UW. And back in 2010, I was in grad school in robotics, and Rob Platt from MIT gave a talk on exactly this kind of phenomenon that I love so much about robots. So it's in something called the light-dark domain. What I want you to imagine is a robot that needs to navigate in a room. We see the top-down view here. The robot is represented as a point. And there's a goal position, and there's a start position. And interestingly, unlike the maze earlier, the robot does not know exactly where it is. It has uncertainty. You can see its uncertainty represented by this disk. Okay, so it doesn't know where exactly it is. And what's interesting about this domain is that it's darker here and it's lighter here. Its sensors work better in the light. So if it's in the light, it gets more accurate readings. When it's in the dark, it gets noisy readings. And it has to reach its goal. That's his job. Now, what Rob Platt shows is that you can approximate the partial observable Markov decision process that this induces, and the robot will figure out to move into the light just enough to reduce its uncertainty enough where its sensors work better. And once that's done, it can go and reach its goal with enough accuracy. So this moving into the light, again, is something that's a strategy that you write the optimal decision-making problem, and the robot figures out that that's the way to go. And then, so this was 2010, around 2011, my lab mate, Shervin Javdani, did something analogous to this on the robot, where you see here the robot, if it just goes straight for opening this door, it doesn't know exactly where the handle is, so it fails. But in his work, Shervin was showing that you can take this sort of information gathering actions where you go and touch the thing to be able to localize it first, and then once it's localized, you go in for the grasp. Okay, so that's how this like moving to the light metaphorically plays out on a different platform. Okay, so I will greatly simplify, but essentially the message is that you take the robot, you tell it the basics of how the world works, some form of F equals MA, right? Again, I'm oversimplifying. That's how the world works. And all of a sudden, it can do really awesome magical things. Like this one. This was also circa, I don't know, 2009, 2010, Zico Coulter's work. So that's really great, right? But while these techniques enable robots to be autonomous and do magic, I was very disappointed in grad school in my first few years to realize that they're very far from being enough. Because if you look closely at these pictures, there's something missing, isn't there? What's missing? You know the title of my talk, so you can probably guess. The people are missing. The world for an autonomous car doesn't look like empty roads. Yeah, there's no one at the steering wheel, but there's a ton of people around, pedestrians, cyclists, people on scooters, and so on. And the car needs to do its job in coordination with all these people. What I like to say, my favorite movie is WALL-E, and I like to say that it's not enough for robots to be capable of doing their job when people have left the planet. It can't be, well, I can clean up, but please humans evacuate, and then I'll be able to do stuff. We need them to work while we're still here. Even drones, you don't think of them as sort of somewhere in the sky. They can't escape people either. This is a drone from Skydio. Its job is to follow people around and take cool videos of them while they do their favorite activities like running or mountain biking. In my case, getting married. Here's a photo from my wedding. Here I am, getting married. This is my family, and this is the Skydio drone that was moving around and trying to record this. And even WALL-E made itself useful to my personal life before we killed off the planet. Chris, my husband, built this, and it drove in on New Year's Eve one year, and looked around. It was all cute, and then it ejected this Lego box with an engagement ring, and that was his proposal. So, really cool version of robots around people. So, after a couple years in grad school, working on robot manipulation, optimal motion planning, it really started to bug me that we have all this great machinery for optimal decision making, all these tools for robots that act in isolation, but when there needs to be a person around, like in this little diagram I have going, the person wants a coffee refill, comes in, it seemed like all of this machinery was gone. It was no longer useful. And we were back to sitting down and telling the robot, here's the actions you need to take, or we were back to at the least specifying the high-level strategy that the robot needs to use to be effective at dealing with the people. Let me share two examples of that. One of them is, so 2009, the Google self-driving car project started. A bunch of CMU faculty and some of my friends left to work on this project. 2010, I read this article in a newspaper. Their car got stuck at a four-way stop because it's treating people like moving obstacles and does the optimal decision-making thing. And people would inch forward into the intersection. The car is like, well, I can't collide, so it's optimal to stay put. Let the person go. In the meantime, the next person would come in, wonder why the heck this car is not going, inch forward into the intersection, keep going. And so people keep going. The article discussed keep waiting for the other human drivers that kept inching forward, looking for the advantage, paralyzing Google's robot. And then Sebastian at some point told me that, look, they had to actually tell the car to inch forward at intersections, right? So, and that, that to assert its turn. And that's great and everything, but why isn't that, something that the car figures out that is a thing that it should do? Another example that I have for you is also 2010. We did this demo for research at Intel Day. Our robot would pick up these bottles, and some of them it would turn around and try to hand over to people in the audience. And it turned out that the robot was doing a baller job, 90-something% success rate at picking up the bottles. But when it came to the handing them to people part, it was something like 3% success rate. And the reason was 3%, 5%, something like that. It was a long while ago. It would turn around, it would say, please take the drink. And then it would wait for the person to pull the drink from it. And the person had no idea what the robot means by please take the drink. And so Mehmet here was becoming part of the interaction algorithm and explaining to the person what the robot needs them to do. Look, the robot's trying to hand you over something, take it away from its grip. And so then Maya Chakmak, UW faculty and good friend of mine, came and visited the lab. And she's a fantastic HRI researcher, and she came up with this awesome strategy that the robot needs spatiotemporal contrast. It needs to pick up the drink and hold it in one way, but then when it's ready to hand it over, do so in a very contrasting way. That makes it clear to the person what the robot wants them to do. And so that worked. That fixed the problem. But that's different from the stuff we were talking about, right, with Rob Platt moving to the light, where we told the robot, here's the goal, deal with it, right? And the robot figured it out. No, we needed Maya for the handovers to work. So, okay, so what? Why is it not ideal for us to have to come up with these strategies for interaction ourselves? And the reason I was frustrated by this was really because of scalability. Was really because it felt like this whack-a-mole of, I fix one problem, I have another problem, then I have another problem, and I have to keep designing interaction strategies. So to give an example, a few years later, there's another article, Waymo's minivan struggles to merge into the left lane because essentially, similar problem, right? You're trying to go into the left lane, people keep coming, and then you get stuck and have to take the exit. The car knew how to inch forward into intersections. This is a very similar problem, but inching forward is not the solution. Something else is the solution, and they didn't have that strategy there. Similarly, right, Maya worked hard to figure out how the robot can make it clear that its goal is to hand over the drink for you. And then she went back to Georgia Tech, where she was doing her PhD, and left us. And one day, I was across from the robot, and I noticed a very similar problem to the handover one. Imagine you're cleaning up the table, and the robot is reaching for one of these bottles, and you want to grab the other one. So let's do a little exercise here. Which bottle is the robot reaching for? It's actually, we did a study on this. It was pretty close to 50-50. It's pretty confusing. This was a slowed down version of the optimal motion planner that I was working on. And it was great at reaching efficiently for the fuse bottle. That was awesome. But if I was in an interaction with the robot and wanted to know what it was up to, very confusing, right? It wasn't taking that into account. And spatiotemporal contrast, which was a great strategy for handover, it was not clear how you would apply it here, right? You had to come up with something else, and I'm not as creative as Maya, and so basically, the conclusion is everyone has to have Maya track mark on speed dial to figure out how to get the robot to actually work well with people. Here's a picture I took at UCSF. Which is this hospital I gave birth at, and it was very amusing. They have these tugbots, they move around and deliver stuff, and I'll read it, I'll read it for you. Allow tug robot to ride elevator alone. Because tugboat can move around, but not around people. It's just like if it needs to take the elevator, people move out of the way. That's the only way it can actually function. And you can look, there's this person here, so on corridors, you'll have to deal with people, and it just goes smack in the middle, and people are like way to the side, giving as much space as possible. So it's not how we want robots to work. So if we can't rely on specifying interaction strategies, on designing them ourselves, and we want the robot to figure these out, what can we do? And optimal decision making, we established, it's awesome for enabling robots to figure out strategies for interacting with the physical world. So then the question is, how do we get the same benefits when it comes to interaction with people? Is that possible? Can we go from saying, hey, you have to inch forward here, to saying, this is your objective, there's a person around also doing stuff, good luck, figure it out, right? That's what I'd like to do. And so I spent much of my research career, so from 2011 until now, exploring how to go from this, which is robots in isolation, to something where the human is part of this formulation, to something where the human is actually part of the state that we're considering when we do optimal decision making. And what's tricky is when robots act in isolation, well, the way it worked is they understood enough about the physics of how the world works to figure out what actions to take, to figure out, okay, this would be a good idea. Now, to produce optimal actions around people, they have to understand how humans work, right? And you won't produce things like, oh, it's a good idea to inch forward into intersections by thinking about F equals ma alone. F equals ma is not enough to tell the robot, to have the robot figure out, oh, I should inch forward into this intersection. That's not going to cut it. What is probably going to cut it is to do something like neuroscience, the physics of the brain, right? That's what dictates how people work. But I don't know if Rao is here, but we don't know enough about how the brain works to come up with that. And so if we can't do that, is it even possible to get robots to figure out how to interact with humans? Or are we stuck with handcrafting these strategies? And it turns out, I think the answer is yes. If we formulate the optimal decision-making problem as something called a partially observable stochastic game, general sum game, I obviously don't expect all of you to know what this means. That's what I'm here for. But at the high level, it turned out that, at least in my view, that there is an F equals ma equivalent for interaction with people. And that essentially is to acknowledge that the person is their own decision-making agent, that they have an objective, that that's what drives their actions, and that the human and the robot act in the same space. And so there's this interplay between robot and human actions. So what I'd like to do sort of in the remainder of our time together today is to take you sort of step by step through this problem formulation, what it means, what I've learned from looking at interaction this way. Certainly not easy to get robots to actually solve these kinds of problems, but it turned out that if you manage to do it, some really magical-like things actually emerge. So we'll take a little bit of a journey through what these emergent strategies are and essentially what these words and confusing arrows mean. And you'll notice that the first thing about this optimal decision-making problem that I'm proposing here is that I'm calling it a game, right? So a game, what is a game? A game is a mathematical construct. You might think of something like chess, but more of what I want you to think about when I say game is something like the game of chicken. Who knows the game of chicken? Yeah, okay. So the game of chicken works in the following way. You have two cars heading towards each other, and they each have a utility or a payoff, and they can decide to both go straight, and then they crash, and that's very bad for both of them. They can decide to both swerve and avoid, right? And that's like okay for both of them. But if one decides to go straight and the other one decides to swerve, it like really pays off for the one who decides to go straight, right? So it's slightly better because the other one is chicken or whatever. A similar one that you might have seen is the prisoner's dilemma. Again, similar concept. So what does this have to do with robots and humans coexisting? Well, take coordination at a four-way stop. So what happens here? You have a human and a robot. They each have a goal. They each want to go first. That's a competitive thing. They each want to avoid collisions, so that's a collaborative aspect. Each of their utilities depends on what the other does, too. And what that means that what one does influences what the other will do, okay? Which is very much like the game of chicken. So that is what you see here. Each agent takes actions in service of their objective. And you might wonder, sure, in theory, this is true, but in practice, do we really play chicken with each other on the road? Like, come on. And it turns out, sort of the answer is yes, in small ways. More often than you think, you exercise your game theoretical muscles without realizing when you drive on the road. And let me share an example. So let's say that you have this car here. If you want to, and then there's a human-driven vehicle over here in the left lane, and you need to merge into the left lane. You in orange need to merge into the left lane, right? If you just kind of think of this as some, uninfluenceable moving obstacle, you predict that they'll keep going, right? The optimal thing for you will be to slow down and merge behind them, which seems fine, except if there's another one coming, and another one, and another one, and another one. And when you are faced with that kind of situation, the rope to the robot, right? Well, now it's kind of stuck. It either waits for a big enough gap in traffic, pisses a bunch of people off behind, or continues and doesn't make its merge like we read in that article, right? You probably invent a third option. I know about you, but certainly I do, which is to just nudge yourself in there. Why? Because you know that this person will probably brake to accommodate for you, right? That requires reasoning not just about, there's a robot and there's these moving obstacles, but your actions influence the actions that other people take. And that's what the game allows you to do. You can think of the human as, yes, they have a goal, they want to go first, they also want to avoid collisions. And so their utility or payoff depends on what the robot does. And so that means that if you think about it as a game, you account for the fact that the robot action influences the human action. Because that's the optimal thing for the person to do when faced with this situation. And so that's what enables the robot to figure out, yes, I can go in front, the person will slow down. And that's sort of, what's optimal for the human to do given the robot's behavior. It can nicely generalize this. Remember, we talked about generalization as being something you get out of optimal decision making that's hard to get with hand design strategies. Well, if you start far in front of the person, you don't accelerate that much. If you start behind, then the robot just merges behind and doesn't try to go for it, right? So it adjusts depending on the situation, and it does so automatically. More than that, what we try to do is we try to take this exact same thing, exact same model, and apply it at a four-way stop. And I'll share with you now my favorite example ever of an emerging strategy from working on robots interacting with people. And it's a weird one. It took me a while to digest this when I first saw it. So we put the robot at a four-way stop. Again, robot is in orange, with a person. And we actually wanted to see what happens if we say, your objective, you, the robot, is to get the person first through the intersection. Okay? What would you do? What would you do if you're the robot and you really wanted the person to go first? You didn't want to go through. You wanted the person to go as fast as possible through the intersection. You would wave, you would say things. Yeah. Right? Okay. Josh, what were you saying?
Is there a penalty for getting hurt? I mean, that's the
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You don't want to, you don't want to collide. All of that, you want to stay on the road, all of that stuff, but you get brownie points for the person going as quickly as possible. Okay, so that's one option. Get to the intersection as fast as you can, and then the person will go. Yeah. You could also, stay there, and at some point the person figures out, they're like, do you go? Do I go? Okay, I'll go. You can also try, waving, blinking lights. I don't know. Those things tend to be confusing, especially the light blinking. I never know if the person is swearing at me or telling me to go. Honking, similar thing. Are you honking because, what am I supposed to do here? The robot did something else. It didn't stay put. It didn't go quickly through the intersection. It, wait for it, decided to back off. It decided to back off. And I looked at this, I was like, what? And then, this was Dorsa doing this work, and she came, I remember this, she came to my office, and she was like, okay, I ran this thing that you wanted me to do, but something kind of weird happened. And I saw this, like, huh? And then, cool, like the little, I don't know how to describe the emotion, like a little alarm bells went on. I'm like, oh my God, this is actually really cool. So if you think of what the robot's model is, it's collected some data, blah, 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 it figured out some things, but essentially its model is the person wants to be efficient and avoid collisions, right? And stay on the road, blah, blah, blah. And so if the robot eliminates itself as a possible collision threat, then it's more likely for the person to go through. I kid you not, this worked in a user study with people. They went faster through the intersection. And then I looked at human-robot interaction literature, and I found this thing called a back-off strategy. It's not for cars. It's for social navigation. But they're basically describing this notion of if I have a robot and you get to a narrow corridor or a door at the same time as a person, what the robot should do to indicate to the person that it should go is to actually back off. You probably have done this too. You probably don't know about it. You're not aware of it, but you probably have done this too. So it's called a back-off strategy. And the back-off strategy is just something that emerged out of optimal decision making. We told the robot, here's the partial observable dynamic general sum game, solve it. And the robot has figured out that it would be a good idea to back off. Tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about the nuances of learning this from data versus modeling it but that's sort of the main takeaway. So that was awesome. So the game aspect enables us to account for this influence between human actions and robot actions. Robot actions influence human actions. That's what the game gives you. Now, right, robot actions, human actions, it ties them together. Now the other word here that's important, or phrase, is partially observable. Let's talk about that for a little bit. So if you think about it, yes, there's a human objective, right? We talked about in cars being efficient, avoiding collisions. But the robot doesn't necessarily get to know this objective. Like in this little diagram, we think of, well, the person wants coffee. The robot doesn't a priori, no one tells the robot, it's not written anywhere, that that's what the robot, that's what the human wants. Similarly, we talked about the game, we talked about the human wants to go first, the human wants to avoid collisions, but the reality is different people actually have different ways they trade off these important features, right? Not everyone drives in the same way. Some people are really defensive and care about, avoiding collisions much more. The good news is that How many of you have had someone tailgate you? Yeah? Someone weaves through traffic like crazy. You've seen that? Yeah. When you observe these actions, does it tell you something about the person's trade-offs between avoiding collisions and being efficient? Yeah, and it helps you anticipate future behavior, right? So it's the same for robots, and this is what this partial observability enables us to capture. People have these objectives. They're hidden, they're latent, they're not directly visible to the robot. But that's okay. Remember the light-dark domain where the robot didn't know exactly where it was? We know how to handle this stuff. It's just in this case, the human actions themselves become the sensor readings, become the information that the robot gets to help it interpret, estimate what this objective is. So much like you use your camera, the pixels you see to say, well, are those pixels consistent with the object being there or there, right? That's how estimation works. Similarly, you can use human actions and say, are those actions of the person tailgating me like crazy consistent with the person being a nice defensive driver or someone who really values efficiency much more over safety? And so it helps you estimate. And I'll show you an example of where this has been really helpful. So here what I want you to imagine is that I have this robot. It's in my lab right now, but imagine with me that it's in my house and it's helping me unload the dishwasher. And it's moving this mug. Maybe this is my favorite mug. And I see it move this mug and I freak out because it might drop it, right? It's really high up. What if it drops it? It will break. So then what I might do is I might physically intervene and correct the robot. Right, I pushed it down to get it to keep the cup closer to the ground, closer to the table. Okay. How the robot, if the robot does not think about partial observability, blah, blah, it's just like, look, I'm a robot, I have an objective, what are the optimal actions to take? What do you think it does when I let go? It goes back, right? Because it thought that keeping the thing high up is the right thing to do. So the moment I let go, it goes back. And I push on it, and it's, it appears really stubborn. It goes back, and I push on it, and it's like, no, keep the frickin' mug closer to the table. And this is called physical interaction, and researchers have studied physical human-robot interaction, and there's actually quite a number of strategies people have proposed in the literature. For instance, you could render an impedance. You could move in the direction of the human force. You could reject the human force. This is more like the control theorists proposed that, not the HRI researchers, but moving on. You could apply a torque that's equal to negative gravity. Basically what that means is it turns the robot into, feels very light because it compensates for gravity and you can just move it around however you want. All of these are somewhat reasonable things to do in whatever context. None of them get the robot to freaking keep the mug closer to the table, which is what I want, right? But what gets the robot to keep the mug closer to the table is the robot thinking of the person as having an objective that it doesn't necessarily know and looking at human actions as sensor readings about what that objective is. And when the robot does this, it thinks, well, what objective could you have? What preferences could you have? What trade-offs between things could you have that are consistent with you bringing me, closer to this table? And then, depending on what your featureization is and blah, 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 it figures out that, look, what's consistent with this is that you want me to keep the thing closer to the table, so I'll optimize for that now. And then tapping into generalization. Here, we have a user correcting the robot so that it doesn't spill the cup, so it corrects the cup orientation. And the robot's like, yeah, okay, I'll keep the cup upright. So it's really important for human feedback to be seen as evidence about what people want, rather than the robot holding this, I know what to do, and I will reject your feedback as a disturbance. Now, estimating objectives is important in driving too. So we found this video on the internet. This is a truck driver. And this is a car that merges merged in front, and this is a second car that comes in, and the truck, I won't show you the rest of the video, it doesn't end well. The truck driver just does not slow down, does not slow down. So you can't, this thing I said in the beginning of, look, it's in the person's interest to slow down. That's the optimal thing to do, given that you're going in front of them. Yes, for defensive drivers, for very aggressive drivers, or for unattentive drivers, that's not what they'll do. And so you can't just assume an objective. Again, that partial observability is important. Unfortunately, if you apply partial observability naively, meaning passively, you're just looking at the human actions and estimating what their objective might be, but also always just reacting to that information and doing the best you know how to. It kind of turns the robots into these very conservative robots again. And the reason is, you're driving next to the person, you account for this possibility that they're an aggressive driver, so it's not safe for you to just go for it, right? And then you observe a human action, they're driving next to you. Unfortunately, if only my clicker worked. Okay, unfortunately, people drive in the same way when they drive straight on the highway for the most part. So not always you'll actually observe a big difference between aggressive drivers and defensive drivers. The actions look very similar. So then the robot is like, okay, I didn't really change my estimate much. I still don't know, so I still can't go for it. And so you get to this very, very defensive robot again. But going back to this, when you put this together with acknowledging that it's a game, so actually tapping into the fact that robot actions actually influence human actions. Remember the whole first part of the talk was about that. And human actions are the robot sensor readings about the objective. Now that means that robot actions influence the sensor, the observations that the robot will get about the human. So this if you need to know things about the person in order to achieve your goal, you'll figure out what actions you need to take to get the information that you need. So that's another emergent property of thinking about interaction in this way. And so the robot is basically asking itself implicitly, this is how people respond if I just go straight next to them. What could I do that actually gives me very different responses that are informative depending on what my actions are? And it figures out that by getting close to the person's lane, that now triggers a response from the person. If they slow down, the robot updates its estimate, thinks the person is defensive and is comfortable going in front. But if the person doesn't slow down or accelerates or whatever, then the robot updates its estimate and gets out of that situation. And at a four-way stop, the robot thinks it's optimal to inch forward into the intersection to see if the person will let it go or not. If the person stays there, great, it goes. If the person proceeds, then the robot lets the person through. This inching forward into the intersection ends up being the optimal thing to do, but only if you think about interaction as a partially observable dynamic general sum game, right? That you need to understand both that your actions influence the human and that you don't know stuff about the human's defensiveness against the human's objective, and through that, what the robot figures out it needs to do is to actually probe at the human. And it's very metaphorically similar to going into the light to gather enough information so that you can then make your goal. Right now you're inching forward to gather enough information about the person so you can figure out how to achieve your goal. Okay. Now, going back to this, the robot acting in ways that are confusing. Right, remember this was the example of the predictable motion of the motion that my optimal motion planner in grad school was generating. This notion of partial observability is not just that the robot doesn't know the human's objective and looks at human actions as giving it information about the objective. It goes the other way around as well. The person doesn't know the robot's objective. That's partially observable to the person. And whenever the robot acts, that ends up informing the person about what the robot's objective might be. So it's symmetric. And when you tap into that, so when the robot actually accounts for this, that's when it produces actions that are trying to be informative to the person. So here you see the robot starting off with sort of a straight trajectory to the goal on the right and realizing that this will be confusing to a person because it's consistent with both objectives, both the goal on the left and the goal on the right. And then you see the robot starting to exaggerate, this is the optimization process running, starting to exaggerate its motion to the right, thinking that will make it more clear to the person that it's the goal on the right that it's going for. Exaggeration is one of the 12 Disney principles of, this is my thesis work, so I'm going all the way back to that. But exaggeration is one of the 12 Disney principles of animation. Right? If I asked an animator, hey, how would you solve this problem? They'd probably come up with a strategy like exaggeration. It just happens because you're telling the robot, look, you have an objective, the person doesn't know the objective. Your actions are evidence to them about what your goal is. And so here's the robot, trying to, we call this legible motion, trying to be very clear to you. And the generalization here, right? So if you have a small object and a fat object, then the robot opens its hand like much more than needed to indicate it's the big one that I'm going for, and closes its hand a lot as it's reaching for the small one to say it's the small one I'm going for. So it extends to other degrees of freedom. It extends to communicating things like driving style, where you show to the person some really sort of aggressive behavior to convey to them. So there's just a number of different strategies beyond these that I didn't have a chance to talk about today. But really, I think, in a sense, the takeaway is we can think of interaction as this optimal decision-making process that's no longer a single agent decision-making, but it's this sort of two-agent. And the fact that it's a game enables us to figure out that human actions and robot actions influence each other and account for this as we interact. The fact that it's partially observable enables robots to understand human feedback, to look at human actions as evidence about what people want, as opposed to assuming that's some fixed thing, and vice versa, to think about how their actions are going to be interpreted by the people, by the humans who they're interacting with. Overall, right, this is all started with we need to put the human as part of the state in this optimal decision-making problem. And I think what this has taught me is, in the sense that there is at least a starting place for an F equals ma equivalent when it comes to interaction. Just like F equals ma, sort of basics of how you interact with the physical world. I think thinking of interaction through this lens, sort of the basic of how you deal with humans. And in turn, that makes it true that optimal decision-making can actually be leveraged to get robots to figure stuff out, to figure out how they interact, not just with the physical world, but with humans as well. I started all this by saying I sort of fell in love with AI by reading the Russell Norvig book. I got to edit the robotics chapter in the latest edition and put all this stuff about it's actually a general sum game. It's you have to actually account for people. It's not just robots in isolation. I had to put that in. So really happy about that. Now, there's a talk tomorrow, technical talk. This is very kind of high level, but there's a technical talk tomorrow that sort of says, yeah, okay, game theory, great, but are people really rational? Can we just throw a lot of data at the problem? So that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow. And with that, I'd like to thank the folks in the Interact Lab and show you this slide this is not emerging from the beautiful game that I described, but it's very cool nonetheless. I got super excited in 2011 by Leila Takayama's paper on readable motion. She worked with Doug Dooley, who's a Pixar animator, to animate the PR2. and make its motion readable. And I looked at that and I thought, oh, this moves like Wall-E. Like it basically, like Doug turned the PR2 into Wall-E, and it was really, really cool. And so it's always been a dream of mine to get robots to move in expressive ways beyond just the functional objective that they have. Here's my goal. And in particular, to sort of move in emotive ways and respond to human emotion. And we finally got to do a project on this. So here's, we learn kind of a latent space for emotive motion, and we optimize for trajectories to be close to that space while still being functional. And this is a Cassie biped. Reaching the goal region is in green, and avoiding the obstacles, and doing so in a kind of afraid, hesitant way versus an angry way. And then you can also tap into language models, and so map the language into the latent space. So that enables things like I can come in and say, great weather today, or I had such an exciting day, and then you have robots that actually move in like kind of happy, excited ways. Versus if I come in and say, oh, I had such a terrible day, I'm exhausted, then the robot no longer jumps and like that's all crazy, but sort of is lower energy, kind of closer to the ground, and sort of, empathizes with your, oh, okay. And I'll stop here, but I just wanted to share this. This does not emerge from the stuff that I told, just to clarify. It takes a lot more design that we put in. We don't just set an objective, go like, go for it. But it's cool nonetheless. I wanted to share that with you. So thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Well, we have time for some questions, so I suggest people come up to the mic if they have questions.
Or you could raise your hand and we could, just.
I can repeat the question.
Repeat the
Yeah.
question so people online.
So you talk a lot about like specifying objectives or rewards. I guess I was curious about your thoughts about constraints. How does that play? How do constraints interact with the rewards?
Yeah, so the question is, I presented objectives as I alluded at optimization in the sense of reward functions or cost functions. What about constraints? I can say a few things about that. One, at the end of the day, a constraint is just this binary objective, infinity here, 0 elsewhere. So it doesn't really affect, I think, the sort of the way at the high level, the bird's eye view that I presented today. I don't think it really affects this view. But there is work on, for instance, looking at human feedback and inferring constraints instead of inferring objectives, right? So what do we do? Inverse reinforcement learning is this notion of inferring the reward function. There's work that it looks at human behavior and tries to infer constraints. There's also some work. So this is Dimitri Berenson at Michigan did some of this, some work at Berkeley, not mine. Shankar Shastri's group did some of this. There's also work on inferring formal specifications. So Sanjit Sesha at Berkeley did some of this with Marcel Vasquez. They look at human demonstrations and they try to figure out what linear temporal logic specification it satisfies. So that's that's one type of work that I would point to. But yeah, at the high level, it doesn't, whether there's costs or constraints or costs and constraints, I don't think it really changes the overall structure of you have this general sum game and you have partial observability over what the parameters of these things are, and you have to just deal with that.
I have a sneaking suspicion your 11-month-old has interacted with a few robots, whether it's a vacuum or else. Can you share any observations for how an 11-month-old either aligns or breaks with your expected interactions?
Yeah. So Lucas has he actually has a toy that's a robot that someone got for him. And he can push buttons on it and it starts moving on its own. And what's fascinating to me is that somehow at 10 months, when I showed him just a tape measure, simple tape measure, right? You pull it out and it pulls back in. So I demonstrated that. He freaked out. This notion of where's this thing going? It breaks probably his predictive model of the world, and he just starts crying like crazy. But when I push on the robot, and then the robot starts singing, at some point starts moving, no problem. I don't know why. I think there's a lot of psychology, developmental psychology studies that point to babies ascribe agency to robots. So the way kind of it connects to this talk is, we talk a lot about, well, people look at robots and they infer objectives, they infer sort of hidden state of the robot, right? And in a sense, for babies, there's a little bit of, it's unclear whether they do that. They do that with people. It's unclear whether they do that with robots. There's a very early paper where they didn't quite do robots, but they did a machine of sorts, animatronics or whatever, and they showed that babies would infer the human's intent. So the way they do stuff like so. Here's since I can geek out about psychology. So here's a study. You have an adult and across from a baby, an infant, or a toddler, and the adult, there's a button, a light, that you press the button and the light turns on. And the adult presses the button with the head. And then you look at what does the baby or infant or toddler do. Do they press it with their head or do they press it with their hand? And it turns out at some point, children start thinking about our actions as intent-driven. And so you see that children imitate the head if there's no explanation for why the person, could have used their arms but didn't. Whereas if the person has their arms tied to the back or in a blanket, something like that, and they use their head, then the child just uses the hand. So we know that that children look at human actions and interpret and try to figure out the objectives, the goals that they have, even if they're suboptimal, attempted actions, etc. When people do these kinds of studies with machines, in the early days, they found that children do not attribute intent to the machines, which is weird, but I think we need to revisit that in light of new, maybe more natural moving robots and so on. But that's a long-winded way to say, Lucas interacts with robots and somehow he doesn't get freaked out by when they move in ways he doesn't understand, but he gets really freaked out by other objects, so there's something there.
So you have a trained model. Let's go back to the car example. So could you train this now from real video of watching humans in an intersection? So you say I have a base model. I learned a probability distribution for aggression. Let's call it that for any better lack. It sees like, oh, but when I watch real videos, everybody inches, even turning into the left lane, there's this probability distribution of a gap where people go for it. Can it just say, oh, just augment my model with that little bit of extra risk because I actually saw it in a 10-minute video of the intersection?
Yeah.
I just need to update my models.
Okay, so let's dig into that question because there's multiple answers to that. So one aspect is, no matter how the only way for this to be an acceptable level of risk to the robot is for the same reason it's an acceptable level of risk to you, which is that you know that the person's actions are affected by your behavior. If you don't give that robot the understanding, it can look all at once at, people seem to kind of go for it. Maybe I should just be more risky. But under all its sort of simulations of how it will play out, they will think that it's getting into a collision, certainly. So it needs to understand.
If you give it a video, it would see that if you do this, this car does it.
Yeah, so you need to model both the sort of the robot as well as having a model of the person, right? And so you're absolutely right that you don't have to have the game to learn predictive models. So this is the second part of the answer. You don't have to have the game to learn predictive models of the person. This is a bit of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. You can just throw a lot of data at the problem, right? So the robot can learn that if you go and condition on it starting to go in front of a human, the human is likely to slow down. You don't need game theoretic tools for that. You can just sort of look at human behavior and sort of find that pattern in the data. You'll probably see enough of, people going in front of other people. That will be common in the data. So you can probably make those kinds of predictions. Now, 2 issues with that. One issue is that if you're trying to do decision making on the robot side, so in other words, you don't want the robot to just blindly imitate people as well, you're trying to say the robot should optimize for its thing, but now it has this predictive model of how the human behaves. In that optimization process, whether it's reinforcement learning or trajectory optimization, whatever you're doing, you will use this predictive model of the human, and you will query it on many hypothetical behaviors that the robot is considering. Some of them will be, well, what if I go forward? What will happen? What if I go towards the person? What will happen? Some of them will be things that you haven't seen in the data. So by the very nature of doing planning or reinforcement learning, doing optimal decision making, let me call it, against a learned model, you're going to query that model, what we call out of distribution. So you're going to expose that model to new things that are hypothetical things the robot needs to figure out whether they'd be a good idea or not, because it doesn't know, in order to assess, okay, what would the human's response be? Will that work out? And when you do that, these models tend to break if you just observe them based on data. So that's a point that I'll make tomorrow. Another point that's interesting is think about the backing up. The backing up, I'm so proud of that, for the very reason that you never see that happen in car-car interaction. You see it happen with pedestrians, you see it happen, there's other stuff. But with 4-way stops, people don't back up at 4-way stops. This is not a thing. So not only do you don't see that as a demonstration, forget about it, but you could never come up with that because you have nothing in your data that says how the person would react to you backing up. You have nothing that says the person's more likely to go through by just looking at data. So that's an interesting aspect of you kind of need a little bit of something else to tell the robot in order for it to make reasonable predictions in situations, in hypothetical situations that are not well represented in the training data. And interaction usually requires a lot of situations that are not well represented in the training data due to the fact that we try to plan against these models, not just copy human behavior. So we break the models when we do that. And also due to the fact that sometimes, it's useful for these robots to actually behave in a different way than a human does. That's nonetheless effective, and you won't see that. But very good question. Yeah?
Kind of echo Nathan's question. Yes, I agree. Like in the past, everybody do autonomous driving or robotic application based on the real data collection and try to see what is the best way under that scenario, what is the best action you need to take. Okay, that was all days of autonomous driving. I also agree these days people start with a perception model, then do the planning model, and planning model use a lot of automatic decision making. But a lot of those are reinforcement learning. My personal feeling is their assumption is, for example, when reinforcement learning was used for AlphaGo, those kind of scenarios you have a perfect perception. You know what are at stake. In the real world perception, you never get a reliable perception. Number two, when I play AlphaGo or play chess, I only just have one opponent. Here, I have multiple cards. Everybody I need to worry about what's the policy I need to use. What is the reward value I need to come out with. And everybody different. Not to mention humans are unpredictable. So how are we going to still believe there is an optimal decision making instead of we just do whatever the minimal work? For example, Tesla's car these days, they just use that A camera and get the perception. They just make sure I have occupancy matrix, occupancy information, and I'm not, as long as I'm not bumping into the not occupied area, I'm fine. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, so let me summarize that. The points were that optimal decision making is easy in things like playing Go against humans, but it's really hard in autonomous driving because we don't have perfect perception information, because we'd have to deal with multiple people. I'll add to that the fact that AlphaGo is competitive, where this is general sum. So when you want to play well against a competitor, it's really, really okay to do self-play, meaning to assume the person is perfectly optimal and then respond to that. Because when the person deviates, you are only going to do better than what you thought you would do, right? Human mistakes work in your favor, what if you're AlphaGo? If you're a self-driving car, there's this cooperative nature, too, of we try to avoid collisions with each other. And so protecting against sort of the perfect player is no longer enough. Human mistakes actually can hurt you, too. So that's I think, more fundamental challenge than the fact that there's multiple people versus one person. Optimal decision-making, when done properly, can deal with partial information. In fact, what I was showing is that it can deal very well with partial information. Optimal decision-making, when you account properly for the human, right, will lead to these strategies just happen. There's an alternative of just copying human behavior. That's not what Tesla does. You describe Tesla's autopilot as like, don't crash into things and that's it. That's not also what they do. They actually have to do some amount of planning, because just not crashing into things doesn't dictate a way forward. You have to still figure out what you want to do. Copying people is okay, but as we were discussing before, copying people has a few challenges. One is that people are noisy and suboptimal, and so if you just copy people, you're not going to get past human level performance, and the goal here is to get past human level performance. Copying people is challenging because of this brittleness that these models have. When you probe them in new situations, they usually barf. You'll see more of that tomorrow. So the robustness, getting the robustness and safety guarantees of that, really challenging. Even outside of all of that, even if you see everything, all the possible situations, and even if you actually have perfect human drivers, like you do your data collection not in the wild, but with people you train, and they're awesome drivers, so you get data that way, right? So that's like, okay, maybe we can imitate that. Even that is challenging because people have different sensors than what you have. So they know different things. What's optimal for them to do under their partial information is very different from what's optimal for the car to do under partial information. And so I think we have no choice but to push on optimal decision-making and make it work. But it's very challenging because there are people around that you need to deal with and model, and they're unpredictable, and so on and so forth. What I showed today is that there's a path forward, right? There's a beginning of a path forward that's very promising. I'll talk more tomorrow about all the issues that this has and where it breaks and how to kind of merge that with a lot of data.
Well, thank you so much. We should
Thank
wrap
you,
it up.
everybody.
Great questions. And everyone is invited to the reception starting right now. So thank you so much, Professor Dragan.
Thank you.